Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening from London. Good afternoon, good morning, as it may be, wherever you are in the world for those watching online. I'm Ben Kemp, General Counsel at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Very, very warm welcome to this evening's panel discussion with the topic, the title, Can Professional Regulation and Organisational Culture Prepare Us Better for the Next Financial Crisis? I'm delighted to welcome so many of you to this debate. I understand we have some 800 or so in the audience tonight, either here in the room in London or otherwise joining us from different parts of the country and world online. Fantastic to see so many people getting involved in this discussion. And if you would like, we would really like you to get involved throughout the discussion. You may do so via the hashtag IFOA lecture, which is on the screen behind me at any point. For those in the audience, the live audience here, you may do so more conventionally by raising your hand at any point. This debate this evening is part of an initiative we've called the Professionalism Lecture Series. We've been running it for something of a year now. This journey's been going. It's a real flagship event in the series for us. The idea is to promote thinking around what professionalism means, what the professions mean in 2017 and beyond. To promote debate around those concepts, to highlight perhaps the role of professionals in modern society, including actuaries, but across the financial services sector. We've already had events. We started with a relatively low-key event in Edinburgh some 12 months ago. I can't believe the journey we've been on since then. We've had events in London, Gibraltar, Singapore, Hong Kong, different parts of the world. We have other forthcoming attractions, just to flag those to you. You'll find details on the website, including in Edinburgh next week at our GIRO General Insurance Conference, Sir Win Bischoff, Chairman of the Financial Reporting Council. Delighted also that Lord Miners will be speaking at another event, details to be announced for early in the new year. And one of this evening's panellists, Dr. Daniel Susskind, will be speaking at a separate lecture, details again to be announced shortly. So please do watch out for forthcoming events on the website. We believe at the IFOA, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, that professionalism is a core part of what it means to be a member of a professional body. And we aim to play our part in promoting and upholding standards. Indeed, we see it as our core duty as a regulator, professional body, to assure public trust. And we seek to do that in a number of ways. Just to give you but one example, we've recently, in the last year to 18 months, launched our Quality Assurance Scheme in the UK, designed to promote better engagement with the employers of our members, promoting the importance of organisational culture as a conduit to professionalism in the workplace. And the success of the scheme has led to the initiative being piloted this year in Asia as well. But we're also open to challenge, and we're very open to debate this evening. The professions must evolve, we recognise, to meet the changing demands and expectations of their clients, the public, their employers. The world is not standing still, nor can the professions, and nor can the concept of professionalism actually. There are threats out there. We must recognise those, but there's also opportunities. We're here this evening to try to debate some of those issues. Perhaps without further ado, I might introduce you to our chair for the evening, and I'm very delighted to say that is Benny Higgins, sitting to my right. Benny is Chief Executive of Tesco Bank, Group Strategy Director for Tesco plc. He has extensive experience within the financial services sector, starting his career in 1983 at Standard Life, since then holding a number of senior positions with the investment management, retail and business banking sectors. Benny is an actuary. He's a Fellow of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and also a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Bankers in Scotland. He holds a number of other positions, including being a member of the Treasury Task Force on Financial Inclusion, a member of the Scottish Government's Financial Services Advisory Board, Director of Scottish Financial Enterprise, and he has recently, I understand, been appointed as Chairman of the National Galleries of Scotland, amongst his various eminent appointments. Without further ado, Benny, perhaps I can pass the discussion to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here tonight to chair this very distinguished and august panel, who I will introduce in a moment. I do think that it's very encouraging how many people have turned up here in London and the number of people engaged around the world. It's a very important subject, and it's one that I hope we can have a very open and free debate about. It's not just the notion of being prepared for a financial crisis. I think we have to confront the fact that the world is changing, and the nature of professions will have to adapt to those changes in some way. And I think it's also very important to understand that professions are there to serve customers, and I hope during the course of the discussion tonight that we can focus on that to some degree too. If I could introduce the members of the panel. A very familiar face to all of you on my immediate right is Marjorie Ngwenya. Marjorie is President of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. She qualified as a fellow in 2006 and is based in Johannesburg. She's worked across a number of disciplines, including risk management, consulting and reinsurance. She was the editor of The Actuary for 3 years until 2011. She's an active volunteer for the professional body and served for 4 years as a member of the Audit and Risk Committee. She's a member of the Management Board, and as a member of council based outside the UK, Marjorie represents the professional body as an ambassador, connecting with our substantial global membership. She's also a trustee of Legal Resources Trust in South Africa. Welcome, Marjorie. Next along is a very good friend of mine for a long time, Lady Susan Rice. You may recognise Susan from the annual autumn lecture of a couple of years ago. Lady Rice is a chartered banker. She was the first woman to head a clearing bank in the UK, has held positions as Chief Executive and then Chairman of Lloyds TSB Scotland, the first Chair of Scotland's Fiscal Commission, and she was a Director of the Bank of England until 2014. Among her extensive current roles, she is Chair of Scottish Water and Business Stream. She's a Non-Executive Director of Sainsbury, the North American Income Trust, the Big Society Capital and the Banking Standards Board. I also encountered Susan in more recent years when she was a very important player in the Chartered Banker Professional Standards Body, which she did a splendid job on. Welcome, Susan. And finally, but by no means least, Dr. Daniel Susskind, who is a Fellow in Economics at Balliol College, Oxford, where he teaches and researches. He's the co-author of the best-selling book, The Future of the Professions, very relevant to this discussion. Previously, he worked in the British government as a policy advisor in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, as a policy analyst in the Policy Unit at Number 10, and as a senior policy advisor in the Cabinet Office, and he was a Kennedy Scholar at Harvard University. So, as you can see, a very strong panel. I'd like to kick the event off with by asking each of the members of the panel just to say a few words on where they see the future of professions generally. So maybe start with you, Marjorie, and move along.
Thank you, Benny. I'll speak on behalf of the I4A, which is a professional body and not a trade body. And our primary objective is to serve the public interest. And in doing that, we do a number of activities, including regulating and educating our members, as well as conducting research. And regulation really is one of the key pillars for us of our strategy. In serving the public interest, we also promote effectively the reputation of actuaries without being seen as being self-serving. Now, we believe that the value of actuaries is a combination of a certain number of things, including our technical skill set, our ethical and professional values, and the professional judgment that we apply and bring to these problems that we solve on behalf of our clients. Actuaries command trust, not because so much we're technical individuals, but because of our integrity and our public accountability. And accountability doesn't mean so much that we need more regulation. Professional regulation is and will continue to be important within the professions, but ought to be balanced and proportionate and allow space for professional judgment. And we think that that will continue to be the case. We shouldn't, as the world changes, impose unnecessary barriers for our members to innovate as the world changes. So I think there will be new questions for us to answer as professionals. In our case, such as how do we deal with data ethically? I think that frameworks that promote professionalism and accountability will create a more robust environment, and we must be mindful as professionals that the world really is changing. With regard to actuaries, I think this will require us to adapt our technical skills, to move into different roles and fields, and to be bold in moving away from what we've called our traditional fields and embrace technology, which is changing at a rapid pace. I think that the work that actuaries do will be transformed by technology in a more profound way than we've seen before. And we need to keep abreast of these changes and how the world might shape up. I think over a medium-term horizon, we still have a vast role to play in applying our commercial interpretation and our judgment. We need more transparency, however, as the changing world is demanding this increasingly. I think that we will continue to need professional values and judgment if we are going to maintain the trust of the public.
Thank you, Marjorie. Susan?
Thank you very much, Benny. So the panel's been asked a big question, which I'm afraid I immediately reframed and asked myself, how can we tell if the financial system is working effectively now and for the future? And I answered my question with two words, purpose and professionalism. I'll say something about regulation and culture, but under the umbrella of those two P words. Financial services are delivered through products, advice, financial instruments, but as a collective, financial services is about something else. It serves a purpose to enable economic activity across markets and help create wealth across society. And I mean anyway, across the whole of society and pretty much all markets, and for tomorrow as well as for today. That's my yardstick. Yet when we judge the performance of our institutions, we still focus mainly on short-term financial performance, quarterly capitalism, sometimes even on spot numbers. Now, there's no doubt that measurement drives activity. However, numbers are just one interpretation of reality. So I know people who are highly numerate don't like to hear that, but I take great pleasure in saying it. We also take comfort from what's called the tone at the top, a bit of jargon, but what that means is the executives in our businesses who tell the stories that influence culture internally and create confidence in our organizations externally. Are the executives telling us that they're doing the right things, and do the numbers stack up? That's the snapshot we take, but that's a two-legged stool, not very stable to my mind. What about the delivery of the business? Because along with complex systems, there are vast numbers of people who deliver our services, and because they're human, they do this with judgment, challenge, imagination, and greater or lesser degrees of competence. Their interpretation of reality figures large in our organizations, so it behooves us to have standards to guide and judge their broad knowledge and behaviors, professional standards, which to my mind becomes the third leg of the stool, making it a whole lot more stable. So financial services needs regulation, no doubt, no debate there, but apart from what it shouldn't do, good regulation should allow a space for the professions to do their work so that people who work in our organizations can do more than simply follow the rules so that they can exercise judgment. Because when you don't exercise judgment, you don't take responsibility, and surely that's what we need more of, not less. Time will tell whether the new regulatory regimes will deliver accountability, but their focus on accountability has to be a good thing. And if regulation is, as it should be, a healthy constraint on our businesses, then professionalism sits alongside that as an enabler of our people. So let me just shift the lens to professionalism and just ask the question, is banking a profession? I ask that because it's the part of financial services that I know best, but actually it's a part where the professions are doing some catch-up work just now. People say, no, it's not self-regulated, there's no license to practice, no universal code of conduct for bankers, but banking does require specialized, broad knowledge and skills. There exists an asymmetry of knowledge between practitioners and client. There's a need for accountability and confidentiality, and banking provides a service for the public good. These are all hallmarks associated with the professions. And even when the links are strained, professions are still more trusted than companies. Now, professions require standards, and work has been going on in the world of banking in exactly this space. For the last 6 years, I've chaired an initiative led by bankers called the Chartered Banker Professional Standards Board. Based on a common code of professional conduct, we've developed standards of broad knowledge and professional behavior that go well beyond regulation, the first time ever for banking in the UK and just about anywhere else. The CBPSB was the first entity to develop this focus, is the only one delivering standards for individual bankers. Our initiative now touches over half the bankers, or half all of all the bankers working in the UK, and will provide a pathway through qualifications and beyond, ultimately to chartered banker status. More recently, we've seen the landscape filling up with related activities, and we welcome that. I'm also a founding director of the Banking Standards Board, which is one of those. The BSB is focused on the behaviors and culture of institutions more than on the individuals who work in them. It's hard for an institution to turn a lens on itself and really examine what's going on. The BSB provides challenge and support and scrutiny, all drawing on impartial assessments that it does for its members. And recently, we kicked off an initiative to explore professionalism in the broad context of banking, now and in the future. So if that's yesterday and today, what about tomorrow? Because if we look ahead, we'll likely need, and I'm sure Daniel will tell us much more about this in a much more expert way, but we'll likely need far fewer bankers as highly personalized and, I trust, democratized algorithmic systems, artificial intelligence, do a lot more of the work for us. There's no doubt that our services will be increasingly delivered in this way, but such change, profound as it is and will be, doesn't happen overnight, and the path of transformation that follows it isn't always what we predict. So I'd assert that for us, as long as we have bankers, we need to continue professionalizing the way they deliver their work. And as intelligent systems evolve, some of us are now asking the question whether the professions, today's professions, should be setting standards for the AI, for the artificial intelligence that will deliver most of financial services and advice and products in the future. Surely the asymmetry of information that leads us to value the professions today will exist in spades in an AI world, when the digital practitioner is even more impenetrable than the banker on the other side of the table is today. Not only that, but as the delivery of financial services becomes ever more personalized and aligned to the individual's perceived needs, how else can we ensure a future that takes into account not just the individual, but also the collective as well, bringing us right back to our purpose, where financial services should enable economic activity across markets and help create prosperity across society. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Daniel?
Thank you very much. I should just say before I begin, thank you very much for having me on the panel this evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. Lots of the ideas that I want to talk about tonight are in the book that I co-authored that Benny mentioned in the introduction, and it was a book called The Future of the Professions that I co-authored with my dad, in fact. And I think one of the most common questions I get asked is how I came to write a book with my dad. And anyone in the room with a legal background might know that he spent the last few decades trying to understand how technology affects the legal profession. He, before all the excitement about AI began, wrote his doctorate in the 1980s on artificial intelligence and the law. Back then, he was trying to build systems that could solve legal problems. That was his interest. And as I said, he spent a career trying to understand how technology affects the legal profession. But what started to happen, particularly in the last decade, was that after talking to audiences of lawyers, at the end, a stray doctor, a stray teacher, a stray accountant, a stray professional would approach him and say, look, Richard, that's all very interesting, but actually what you're talking about applies equally well in our profession too. And we first spoke about this, it was back in 2010, and I was working in the policy unit in Number 10 at the time, working on lots of different policy areas, on tax policy, on health policy, on education policy, but with a good overview of lots of different professions. And it was clear then that significant change was in the air, and that these professions, although from a distance looked quite different, actually appeared to face a common set of challenges. So we had this idea of joining forces to look at the professions more generally, and that's what we did, and the result was this book, The Future of the Professions. And in our book, we set out two futures for the professions. The first one, I think, will be reassuringly familiar for most people in the room. It's simply a more efficient version of what we have today. And here, professionals of all different stripes use technology, but essentially just to streamline and to optimize the traditional ways in which they've worked, in some cases since the middle of the 19th century. And as you look across the professions, there's lots of examples of this. It's doctors talking to patients via Skype. It's architects using computer-assisted design software to design bigger, more complicated buildings. It's teachers using online material in the classrooms. So that's the first future. But there's then also a second future, and this we think is a very different proposition. And here, technology doesn't just streamline and optimize the traditional ways in which professionals have worked, but it actively displaces professionals from that work. What we call increasingly capable systems and machines, either operating alone or, and this is quite important for everyone in the room, just designed and operated by people that look quite unlike traditional professionals. They gradually take on more and more of the tasks and activities that we associate with the traditional professions. Now, the argument we develop is that for now and in the medium term, we think these two futures will develop in parallel. We'll see, as we do today, examples of both. But we think in the long run that that second future will dominate, that through technology, we're going to find new, better, more affordable, more accessible ways of solving the sorts of problems that in the past only a very particular type of professional has solved. And we think this poses an existential challenge to the traditional professions. And that's the argument and that's the conclusion that we reach in our work.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Now, this is the stage where we all get the chance to participate, and I hope you do. There are two ways. One is through the Twitter feed, which is lying beside me, and the other is the more retro, and I would encourage the retro approach of putting your hand up and being given a microphone. If you are asking a question from the room, if you could wait until you get the microphone so that those who are elsewhere in the world watching this will be able to hear you. But perhaps while you're thinking of your opening questions, I'll put one question to the panel. You know, it's interesting listening to Daniel, this notion that, in future it might be people outside of a profession who have a great impact on that very profession. One of my favourite quotes from a great Canadian public intellectual, Marshall McLuhan, 20th century Canadian public intellectual, was that we don't know who invented water, but we know it wasn't the fish. And rather surreal quote, but I think it applies in this case. So I'd like to ask each of the panel members the following question. Given that there is inevitably going to be a huge amount of change, do you think that the professions are generally in financial services influencing that change? And are they equipping their members to deal with that change? And maybe start with you, Marjorie, with a specific focus inevitably on the actuarial profession.
Thank you, Benny. I think that professions, ours included, probably believe that we will survive if others don't, and perhaps we should think twice about that notion if the second future described by Daniel comes true. And I think the process of being fit for purpose is a process of continuous improvement, and that certainly is the case for us at the I4A. We believe that soft regulation can be effective, and that means seeking to encourage and nurture positive professional cultures and believing that peer influence is also important. I think that Ben alluded to our quality assurance scheme that has shown some success, and we're now trialling that in Asia for that reason. We also have our professional skills regime, and we believe that this illustrates our efforts in the soft regulation area. It's important that we keep our frameworks under review and that we take soundings from outside of our profession. And certainly we strive to do that. We're currently reviewing our actuaries code and seeking input from our stakeholders. But the proof is always in the pudding, isn't it? And I'd really be interested to hear from those who use the services of actuaries whether they believe that we're keeping up to date with what's required.
Thanks, Marjorie. Actually, just perhaps a brief follow-up, which for you. Do you think that what you're doing, what the profession's doing, is focused more on incremental change rather than a potential point of inflection where there is a much more dramatic change along the lines that Daniel has alluded to?
I would say certainly we're responding along the lines of the first future that Daniel described, that we are increasingly adopting technology to improve the work that we do and working alongside other professionals who are complementary to our skill set. And we would need to rethink seriously our strategy if that second future is a reality.
Okay, thank you. Susan?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Are the professional bodies, in the right place, and will they be going forward? Again, I'll just talk from the perspective I have, which is if you look at a bank, a big full-service bank, there must be about 28 different professional institutes which relate to those who work in that institution. That's a lot. And these have developed over the years for various reasons, but often reflect the sort of functional or operational divisions within a bank. And the work that I've been doing in standards for bankers is for all of those others who are not actuaries and not lawyers and not accountants and not investors and don't have another body that they actually can belong to. But I would say looking forward, the professional bodies probably should ask the question, is there a need for that many? What will happen to the organizations that we support and the individuals in them? And actually begin to rethink what a provider of financial services will look like in the future, because it may look nothing like what we consider a traditional bank today. So I think the profession's doing tremendous work today. Some of them are coming together because they realize that there's some strength in merging views and events. So Chartered Banker Institute, CC in investments, and the CII in insurance have formed an alliance. And I think we may see more of that going forward in the near term. But in the longer term, I think the professions need to stand back and say, what is it and who is it we'll be serving going forward, and start from there and work back to the present.
Thanks, Susan. Daniel?
So the question, are the professions and professional bodies prepared? I think there's been a shift, particularly in the last few years, away from, and it's a universal shift, away from thinking that technological change only really affects blue-collar work, to recognizing that actually a lot of white-collar work is also affected now. And I think that's reflected both in popular commentary and what professional bodies write about as well. I think it's hard to generalize either across professions, across jurisdictions about who's prepared or not. But I think one generalization I can make is that a lot of the most exciting change is not happening within the boundaries of traditional professional firms. When we were doing our work, the case studies that really excited us were often those located outside the boundaries of, as I said, traditional professional firms. Let me say one just additional thing on the pace of change, which is what we don't anticipate is a big bang revolution, that tomorrow or at some point in the future, professionals will wake up and find an algorithm sitting at their desk. That isn't what we're describing. We call it in our work an incremental transformation, not where entire jobs disappear in an instant, but gradually tasks and activities that traditionally we've associated with a very traditional type of professional get taken on by very different types of people or not by people at all. And as I said, we call it an incremental transformation. There isn't a big bang revolution, and for those anticipating that or looking for that, I think they'll be disappointed.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. I must say, in my own experience, one thing I would mention is that I joined banking from the insurance world 20 years ago. And at the time, every consultant in banking said that the branch networks wouldn't survive. Of course, they were right, because they probably won't survive, but they were just wrong about the timing. I think even something like a smartphone, for example, has changed the way we live, and it might not have been a big bang, but it's not that far off it, so I think we've got to be somewhat careful. Turning to the audience, who would like to ask a question? As I remind, we'll have a gentleman at the front, if we just wait for the microphone. Thank you. And if anybody else has a question, if you put your hand up, well, I can sort of cue them up.
Thank you. How do you balance the definite need to be professional in this new world against the cost of actually achieving it? Bearing in mind it's your customer who has to pay that cost, and he may well decide to go somewhere cheaper. Okay, they've got maybe lower standards, but so what? He'll get his work done for a cheaper cost.
Okay. Well, I don't think we'll go around the whole panel with every question. So, Daniel, would you like to have a go at that?
I think there's a very interesting distinction to be made when we say we trust the professions. I think there's an interesting distinction to be made between saying when we trust the professions, we think they're reliable, as in they do a good job, they perform as expected, and when we say they're trustworthy, When we say they're trustworthy, we're not just saying that they're reliable, we're saying that they're motivated by a particular set of values or norms or codes of conduct and so on. Just to see the difference, think about how good it feels when a friend tells you you're trustworthy rather than you're simply reliable. And the professions often conceive of themselves as having a monopoly over trustworthiness. And I think what we're seeing more and more in what we call an internet society is that very often people are satisfied with simple reliability. You know, when you look at a lot of the online platforms, 50 million Americans use online tax preparation systems rather than a traditional tax accountant to help them do their tax returns. Those systems are reliable. Whether or not they're trustworthy in the sense that traditional accountants might have conceived of themselves, that they're motivated by a set of other regarding preferences and so on, it's not clear. But consumers and recipients are happy just for reliability rather than that sort of stronger conception of trustworthiness. And I think that's a challenge to the professions. When you look at a lot of the tasks and activities that they do, very often reliability is a sufficient bar. They don't need to go all the way to trustworthiness. And as I said, I think that's a challenge to traditional professions.
Susan, would you like?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with Daniel. Trust, remember, can't be trained for. You can't train your staff for trust. It has to be bestowed by others. That's what trustworthiness is. It's that perception that you're worth that. But think about who and what we trust over time. I mean, there was a day and age long ago when you trusted, dare I say it, your bank manager or your local lawyer, whomever, others in your community. And I mean, my life, and probably I didn't put these here on purpose, but yours is absolutely tied up in this and my little MiFi. So wherever I am, you know, I'm ready to go. This is it. And what you find is that people, and you know, every time, and even I have started doing this to a limited extent, you read comments from absolute and utter strangers, and you make decisions, sometimes big decisions, spending decisions, based on what strangers are telling you. You're trusting what's in here somehow. And I think that the whole sort of psychological notion of who and what we trust is changing. So slightly different from what you're saying, but I think we're really reconfiguring in our own heads. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but I think some of that's happening.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I mean, I think the question does point towards the importance of standards, because when it becomes easier to do things in different ways, the standards that are expected have to be clear. I mean, it's interesting in my banking career, especially the last 10 years of effectively starting up a bank from scratch and having to work out what it would stand for. The research we did was very clear-cut for banks, that they were trusted in the sense that the emotion, well, there's transaction. We used the words transactional trust and emotional trust. There was transactional trust. Customers do believe that banks will take, you know, the money will be in the account where it should be. ATMs will work. Direct debits will work when they should. But there was very low levels of emotional trust. By that, they meant would an organisation put the customer first when they had the opportunity to put the bank first? And I suspect that will not be exclusive just to banks. Another question? Okay, at the front, we'll one at a time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So my name's Colin Wilson. You talked about the importance of standards, and we called it sort of regulation earlier. I'm wondering about what the right balance is and whether that is changing between regulation of institutions, the tasks themselves that they do, like accounting standards, for example, and people, members. Yeah. And in the context of professions, will we need to continue to regulate members in a world where it's actually the tasks are being taken over potentially by machines or institutions?
Maybe ask Marjorie to kick us off on that one.
Thank you, Colin, for that tricky question. I think we may need a balance, so both aspects will be important. If we imagine that the work that is currently done by professions or professionals will be done by others, then I think it will be important to set standards for whoever it is, so individuals, to adhere to. I don't think that all of this work will be done under the banner of institutions or corporations, and therefore if we didn't regulate individuals and their behaviour, we might miss a trick. That's my sense.
I maybe could just follow up with a sort of supplementary question, maybe ask Susan your thoughts on this, but in the context of individuals being set standards, obviously in financial services, the senior manager regime, which has become a very popular subject. I have a fear, and I wonder what you think, that it may discourage people from becoming, for example, non-executives of certain kinds of organisations because of the kind of level of responsibility and pressure on them.
That certainly is a legitimate concern. Lots of people have talked about that. There are debates about bank boards that you need so much knowledge and background and information about banking and all of the regulation that underpins it that only bankers or people very close to banking will really be eligible to sit on a bank board. And yet we hear so much about having different and diverse perspectives and points of views, and isn't it good to have people from different backgrounds? My own personal view, I chair the board of a water company, is absolutely those different backgrounds are really important. People don't all have to know what cryptosporidium is or trihallomethanes to sit on the board of a water company, and you can learn. So I think that that's a real issue, but I think that, as I was saying before a little bit about regulation, that regulation cannot do it all. And actually, regulation that's good regulation, that doesn't constrain too much and doesn't create a tick box mentality, has to make space for and has to allow for something that deals with individuals, which I think the professions can deliver in a way that regulation can never deliver. Because I think that the professions, and through professional standards, you can encourage individuals to make judgments, to think about situations, to consider, to compare, to debate in a given situation, whereas a rule tends to require another rule because another situation has come along and another one, and all of a sudden you're just looking at those rules. So, as I said before, banks and financial services organizations, I think, all need regulation. There's no doubt about that, but it needs to be enlightened and thoughtful regulation.
Thanks, Susan. I mean, just to reinforce the point you made about the composition of a board, I mean, it's a well-established fact that intellectually diverse teams will outperform less diverse teams, and if the regulation forces less diversity intellectually, then I think we'd be weaker for it.
Yeah. So I think that's really important, the point that we need to ferociously guard the scope that we have for professional judgment. Because that allows us to take professional responsibility. And I think in Daniel's binary world, if we abandon the scope for professional judgment, that's what makes us into technicians. That undercuts the need for professionals and leads to your second option of what becomes of professionals. So I think we can all agree that, but you can contrast that with what's happening kind of out there in the real world. Because out there in the real world at the moment, the challenge is that the scope for professional judgment is being continually narrowed. And it's very easy to blame this on regulators, and partly it's to do with regulators, but I do think it's also partly to do with a lack of professional confidence and professionals not having confidence in their judgment. And that's something that I think we need to find a way around. So to give you an example, in my field, in pensions, actuaries increasingly give advice that is just, the regulator expects you to do this. No professional judgment there. The least risk option is this. That they are abandoning professional judgment and instead just going for least risk options. Now, one of my colleagues has characterised this by saying that, an engineer could give you the plans for a bridge that would never, ever fall down in any circumstance. That would be a great bridge, but nobody can afford to build it. But the problem we have certainly in DB pensions now is that actuaries are advising on bridges that can never be built. And that is not good for professions, and it's not good for wider society, because effectively we are abandoning efficient pension provision for, in exchange for very inefficient, low-risk, individual, uncollective provision. And that's not right for anybody. So the question I'm getting round to is, how do we reinvigorate professionals and allow them the ability the confidence to give that kind of advice that isn't just the least risk option, that allows us to rebuild the bridges, to rebuild Britain.
Well, thank you for that very good question. I'm going to ask Marjorie in a moment to be the first to tackle the question. While she's thinking about that, I would just say that it really does resonate with me. I mean, when I joined the faculty as a student in 1983, I always remember one of the expressions that I sort of found that I attached myself to right away before I decided I wanted to be an actuary, and it was the notion of actuarial judgment. And in fact, I have, not with the same access to the conversations that you will have, but I've noticed in my more sporadic exchanges with the actuarial world that it's an expression that gets used less. And I suspect what you're saying is it's because it is present less. Marjorie.
They're tough ones tonight. I think it requires us to interrogate ourselves as a profession, and in what you've described, these least risk options and rules-based solutions are infinitely programmable. So what is the value that we're adding as professionals if that's all we're doing to serve our clients? And we need to continually ask ourselves, and what should our stakeholders be paying for in addition to being able to read a rule book or interpret a regulation? And I think we can support our members by showing them examples of what that looks like and reminding them of what it means to be a member of a professional body that does have judgment as one of its value adds.
Can I just jump in there? Because the issue of judgment is something that comes up very often with conversations about automation in particular and the professions. And what often happens is I'll set out those two futures and someone will say, look, Daniel, you don't understand. What I do as a professional is I exercise judgment. And judgment is the sort of thing that simply cannot ever be performed by a machine. Let's stick with the machine. And I think the question, can a machine ever exercise judgment? I think it's the wrong question. There's two more important questions. The first is this: to what problem is judgment the solution? Why did clients go to professionals and say, give us your judgment? Now, the answer to that question is because of uncertainty. You know, when the facts are unclear, when the information is ambiguous, clients go to their professionals and say, professional, give me your judgment based on your experience and training, perhaps extensive, and help me make sense of this uncertainty. So the better question, the second question, is not can a machine ever exercise judgment, it's can a machine deal with uncertainty better than a human being can? And the answer to that question is, of course they can. That is precisely what these systems and machines are very good at doing. They can handle far larger bodies of data and make sense of them in ways that human beings acting alone simply can't. Let me give you an example. If this were a medical event and there were doctors in the room, they'd say, look, Daniel, you don't understand. When I perform a diagnosis, I exercise my judgment, and I don't know how I do it. You know, I can't articulate it in a set of rules. It's experience, it's intuition, it's gut reaction. I have to look my patient in the eye. I have to get a feel for what his particular ailment is. I can't articulate how it is. How on earth can you ever write a set of instructions for a machine to follow? Now, one of the case studies I think is very interesting is earlier this year, Nature published an article about a system that if you give it a photo of a freckle, it can tell you as accurately as 21 leading dermatologists whether or not that freckle is cancerous. It knows nothing about medicine. Okay? It's not relying upon professional judgment. What it's got is a database of about 128, I think there's somebody who is going to object to this, 128,000 past cases, and it's running a pattern recognition algorithm through it, able to do the sort of task and activity that might have required judgment from a human being, but with lots of processing power, lots of data storage capability, is able to do it in a very different way.
But Daniel, could I maybe just ask that we'll come to you in just one moment? There is no question that with the analytical power of computers and the applications that will be developed, that much more complex things can be done than can be done by a human mind. But surely you would concede that there will be problems that will always leave a residual area of judgment to be applied because it isn't solvable just through pure logic and analytics.
And I think one of the traps that people fall into in thinking about the future of the professions, and it's true in every profession, is so what you say is right. Of course, there are going to be tasks and activities that are very, very difficult to do in other ways. Maybe that will change over time, I don't know, but we can see certain types of problem-solving tasks, certain types of creative tasks, certain types of tasks that require interpersonal skills. We can already see that they're very difficult to do any differently. But one of the mistakes that I think professionals fall into is to identify a particular task or activity that at the moment is very difficult to automate or do differently, and then to backwards induce, to reason backwards from that necessarily the rest of the work that the professions do is somehow immune from technological change. It's an argument from hard cases, and it's a mistake. Professional work isn't a monolithic, indivisible lump of stuff. People perform lots and lots of different tasks and activities. And although there may be some tasks and activities which, as you're right, are hard cases, there's an awful lot of work that the professions do that isn't like that at all.
Sorry, the chap second row.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew Slater. Thank you, Daniel, for what you just said, because I was going to ask you, what actually do you mean by technology? There are bits of technology that just automate what we're already doing. An Excel spreadsheet is faster at crunching numbers than a slide rule. But all it's doing is things faster. Then there's the current hype, you can tell I'm biased, about artificial intelligence. It's not artificial intelligence, these are just non-linear learning algorithms. You talk about uncertainty, and that is indeed what professionals do. We've been trained in a particular environment, be it pensions, insurance, banking, whatever, to work out what is a good decision to make in an uncertain environment. I agree with you on that. But you then go on and give an example of how technology and learning algorithms work where the data is absolutely certain. And these algorithms are easily fooled. And therefore, they're very fragile. Therefore, they are not as good as people are making out today. They may be in the future, but the future for that is 50 to 100 years away. It's not here in the next 5 to 10 years. And that's not me giving my opinion. Those are professionals. These are professors of artificial intelligence saying publicly these algorithms are massively overhyped by the guys in Silicon Valley. Of course they are.
Sure.
To do what they are saying will be done will take 50 years.
I have the thrust of the question. Look, this is you're proposing a technical conversation. I point you towards, I think, some of the most exciting, the particular flaw that you point towards is what happens when the data is fuzzy or incomplete. And there's lots of exciting work going on in artificial intelligence at the moment to design systems that can deal with the problem you describe. Again, of course, there are going to be tasks and activities that at the moment we can't do any other way than the way that human beings currently do them. But it's a mistake to think that everything that professionals do is composed of those particular hard cases. That's the argument I'm making.
Daniel, do you think there is, let's even assume that you're right, it's a question of timing rather than if, do you think there is a risk that there is a too early adoption of artificial intelligence for tasks that it's not ready for, in the spirit of a desire to push along that trajectory?
I think there's a general mistake that's made, which is in thinking about technology, which is that people tend to overestimate the impact of these technologies in the short run, and I think underestimate it in the long run. I think there's an awful lot of hype at the moment, and it's fascinating if you look in the history of artificial intelligence, you see these cycles of hype and excitement followed by disappointment, followed by hype and excitement. So I think the risk you're pointing towards is realistic.
On a quite relatively banal subject, but a very important subject to individuals, I am appalled sometimes in the way that relatively young graduates can be excluded from recruitment processes because of some intervention which didn't involve any person but involved a set of a framework that was assessing them. And I've seen plenty of examples where it's been wrong. So I think it's that idea of, on a more complex level, adoption being too early.
What you're pointing towards is, there's a field which is called algorithmic discrimination, when the systems and machines that we build have biases built into them, often biases that the human beings who designed the systems didn't intend to be there. Sometimes they're actually an interesting reflection of the biases that we often unconsciously have and don't realize we have as human beings, but you're right. And there's work going on at the moment to try and identify these biases and root them out and design systems that are free of them.
Thank you. Another question at the front?
Thank you. My name's James Orr. I was thinking, very much struck by what Daniel was saying, and it occurred to me that there are industries that we could look at. We're talking about the financial services industry. There are industries we could look at now that have been transformed by technology. So the two I'm thinking about is supermarkets, if you don't mind me waving at you and talking about supermarkets, and the one we've recently been hearing about, which is the airline industry, where discount airlines have had a profound effect on that industry and a profound effect upon a profession, airline pilots. And in both cases of the kind of supermarkets, the food industry and the airline industry, from a distance, I'd observe that regulation, particularly thinking about the Civil Aviation Authority, regulation has become very, very, to its essence, absolutely about the safety of passengers and a real focus on that. And so that's one thing. I think that regulation will often end back at its core. But what is the core of regulation for financial services? Another thing I observe is that the powerful forces of competition, which basically say that an airline that is not particularly kind to its customers, but gives it affordable, attractive prices, can determine the trend within that industry, and also determine the outcome for a profession, in this case, airline pilots. And I'd be interested in any reflection from the panel as to if it's at all possible to take those examples and say, well, what does that mean for the financial services industry and the professions that serve it?
I'll ask Susan and then Marjorie, but maybe I'd say a couple of things. I do have a quite unique position in sitting on the spine of a very large organisation where the core business is food retailing, and I'm very much part of that, but I specifically run the bank. And one thing I've observed about food retailing is it is cutthroat competition, and customers have a much bigger influence on on what happens in the industry because of the nature of competition. I mean, for me, a competitive market is one where there's enough choice. It doesn't have to be a lot, but there's enough. That there are no barriers to switching, and the value equation is very transparent. Now, in banking, by comparison, the value equation is not transparent. Nobody in this room knows how much to pay for their current account, for example. And because of that, it leads to all sorts of other consequences. But having been for the last 10 years part of my time in a sector which is so competitive, you realise that a sector like that is driven to a much greater extent by the behaviour of customers. But maybe, Susan, would you...
Yeah, so I also am involved with the rival supermarket. I'm the senior independent director of J. Sainsbury's, not the bank, but the parent. And I would concur with everything Benny just said, but thinking about supermarkets and the impact of technology. So you've got online ordering. I mean, that's something that's relatively recent. What actually does that mean in reality today? It means that there are thousands of people who drive trucks, and they come around to my house and yours, and they deliver your groceries. And I now live in an area where I don't have any market close to me, so I do all my food online. And every single driver who has ever come in the last 2 years since I've lived in this house has been an absolutely terrific face of the organization and interface with me, the customer. I let them into my house. And so it raises questions about how valuable are those roles? Do the supermarkets value them highly? Do we have similar comparisons in other areas where roles which might have been seen as, well, fairly perfunctory suddenly become absolutely key to the delivery of what's going on there? And I think, we all need to think about this stuff a little more carefully. I think all of the value that we put on different kinds of activities will change because, in part, of what Daniel's talking about.
Marjorie?
Thanks, Benny. So I think in financial services, big data is clearly the big topic. And in that regard, if we think about what that means for consumer safety, there are a number of angles that regulators could take. So potentially ensuring that models align with certain standards that are set out and they're approved and are free of the biases that were described by Daniel. It might involve certifying the individuals that are allowed to operate these models. It might relate to rules around how we source and manipulate and publish data, and certainly we can see that that is an increasing trend and a big issue in this regard.
Thanks, Marjorie. Actually, we have been getting some tweets, so I shouldn't ignore them. A question which might be one both for Daniel and for Marjorie. Do we think that the nature of what we're discussing will be very different for a very long time in developing countries? So maybe Marjorie.
That's a very good question. I think to an extent, yes, but actually technology doesn't really discriminate. So I think that the beauty of developing economies is that they can leapfrog technology, and what we're talking about here could equally apply somewhere where you might not think that the technological environment is ready for it. So I don't think that we can
I agree with you. I mean, some of the fastest advances have been when there's been a leapfrogging in banking, for example, whether it be thumbprint technology or for identification or whatever. And so sometimes it affords an opportunity. But Daniel, anything on that?
It's very the question about developing countries is very interesting. I mean, one of the things that motivates our work is that we observe that the traditional professions, traditional hospitals, schools, courts, and so on, are creaking. Not enough people have access to the expertise of first-rate professionals, or indeed any professionals, and that's particularly true in developing countries. And the promise, I think, of a lot of these technologies is making what we call practical expertise, the knowledge, the wisdom, the know-how, all that expertise that professionals have that allow us to solve the problems that we go to them to solve. The promise of technology is to make that practical expertise available in ways that are far more affordable and far more accessible than the traditional professions. And I think the scope in the developing world for using technology to improve access to practical expertise is vast. There is a huge, we call it latent demand, a huge appetite out there for professional expertise that's currently unmet. And the promise of these technologies is that we might be able to satiate some of it.
Susan?
Can I just say very quickly, thumbprint technology is actually very old. In the days when far fewer people were literate, that's how you signed your documents. So it is delivered with less ink now. And I agree with the point about skipping technologies, renewable energy in parts of the south of India. You don't need a grid. 4G in countries in Africa. They didn't go through 1, 2, and 3G. And so that exists. But I really do have a fear because we don't have the same access widely in parts of the world where we have predominantly developing countries. I have a fear that what we're talking about here could lead to a worse kind of sense of haves and have-nots along geographic and regional lines, and that's something I would hope that professions and professionals would give some thought to.
Thanks, Susan. A question here, just a couple of rows back, and then we'll come across to you, sir.
Thank you very much. As the discussion has sort of ventured into technology and professionalism, a comment I'd like to raise is that it seems that regulation and professionalism becomes needed when there becomes a knowledge imbalance. So if we take, for example, the medical profession, they are a very highly regulated profession because you have a large amount of knowledge in a small group, and that small group is providing a very important service. What they do as technology change is actually going to change over time. Now, as we move into this highly developed technological world, I can see that knowledge imbalance actually getting bigger and bigger. So if we take some services in our area of financial services, which might be done by humans but could be done, let's say, by machines or in another way, it's still going to be human people actually building those machines and operating those machines, and the people that do that work are going to have to be professional, be regulated, and be held to account. Because if you've got a handful of people who are designing the apps by which we do our bank transactions or manage our pension funds, so I don't think technology removes professionalism. It doesn't remove regulation. It just changes who and what is regulated and who has to be professional.
But you do accept that it requires the players to adapt to that change.
Yes, I think please, because you still got some people doing important service for many others.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll maybe take the next question.
Hello, it's Trevor Lanwarn. I've got a question for Daniel, because I do a lot in this area, and I'm just trying to think of analogies. And I was thinking also, when I was in government, government does not think of professions as traditional professions. They think of journalists as professionals, and Daniel will have come across some of this. So, on analogies, if you take white collar, but go to the wider view on a professional, are there any analogies which are ahead of where the traditional ones are, which can act as a sort of marker for the traditional professions as to where things may go? And the one that was going through my head as I was hearing others talk was, what's the role of a professional pilot in flying an aeroplane? But whether that's the best one or not, I don't know.
Okay. Daniel?
It's very interesting. I mean, so it's an interesting question. You're looking for occupations that have responded well to technological change, and whether or not you could learn from their example. It's hard. And the pilot example is an interesting one, because such a high proportion of the time that we spend in planes, of course, is on autopilot. It's been directed by a system machine. Again, I think it's hard. I think it's very difficult to generalize. I think it's very difficult to point to particular occupations or particular industries and generalize in such a way to say that they've they as a group have responded well. I think I'd like to make just a general comment, and it draws on the previous question as well, about the role of the difference between deregulation and liberalization. What I'm not trying to do in the ideas that I'm discussing is suggest that it's a free-for-all, that we ought to be operating in an entirely deregulated world. What we're arguing is that we ought to liberalize. We ought to allow different types of people and different types of institutions through technology to solve the sorts of problems that traditionally professions alone have solved. The problem, though, is that the grand bargain that we've struck with the professions, the system of regulations, the arrangement that entitles particular groups of people to provide certain types of services, it's based on a traditional conception of the professions. And so the challenge is, I think, to update, to revisit that grand bargain, to revisit the type of regulation that we impose, but at the same time to liberalize and to allow different types of people and different types of institutions to try and solve the sorts of problems that traditionally just the professions alone have solved.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to the question, but your question makes me pause. It actually reminds me of something I said to Benny a few weeks back, which is that our language is incredibly elastic. And so we use the word profession and we apply it to what were not traditional professions. We have professional journalists, we have professional everything. So we can see a child in a school play and said, oh, they did a really professional job. It's become an adjective that has to do with doing something well, basically. And so I suppose if I were in a professional body, what else is there beyond doing something well in somebody else's judgment? And is it about holding that individual accountable for the impact, for the results of what they do. It isn't just at the moment doing it well, it's actually what is the impact going forward. And to me, it seems that's a really important role that professions and professional bodies and professional standards can play.
Thanks, Susan. Actually, you made me think of something too, which is you made reference to journalism. Clearly, journalism's been hugely affected by the introduction of technology, not so much in a regulatory sense, of course, but the impact on the way, the impact on print media and so on. And I think, and I can't sit here attempting to explain the link, but I think journalism, especially business journalism, has deteriorated hugely in the last 25 years. And I don't think it's unrelated to what's happened to that line of work, that profession. The other thing in terms of the impact of technology, I mean, we're using Twitter here, but you know, the notion that more information to more people would allow people to be better informed and take a broader view, the complete opposite has happened actually, because through social media people just get the same arguments and the same views reinforced. So I think technology isn't always a good solution. We've got to make sure that we make the most of it. I'm conscious that we are sort of out of time. I'll take one more question if there is one, but we're now between you and a glass of wine, I think. So there is one hand here, if we take that as the last question.
My name is Derek Pike. I'd like to agree with Benny's comment about standards in journalism over the years, and it takes me back to Daniel's distinction between reliability and trustworthiness. And can I ask if Daniel thinks it's possible to have a lasting absolute standard for reliability, or is it something that is relative and could over time, if there could be a pressure that driving down any standard of reliability?
Could you just repeat the final bit of that question? The question being whether or not what counts as reliable changes over time.
Yes, if it's possible to frame a reliability in such a way that it will not over time be, the standard be lowered.
Well, I think the argument that was being made by Benny wasn't that the standard of reliability has changed; it's that it's unreliable. I think that was the argument that you
quality.
So I mean, reliability is, how do you define reliability? It's performing as expected, and if expectations change over time, then perhaps what counts as reliable changes over time. But it seems to me that it's a relatively static benchmark, and I don't see technology eroding what it means to be reliable or not.
Thanks, Daniel. Well, look, we are out of time. Thank you again for coming tonight. I hope you found it useful. I hope those that are elsewhere who have been watching could hear properly and it was useful to them too. So thank you for being here, and a very special thanks to the panel tonight, Daniel, Lady Rice and Marjorie. So I hope you can join us outside. Thank you.